Welcome, everyone, to the first in a series of 4 programs on the sound of Japanese music. My name is Brenda Jordan, the University of Pittsburgh National Consortium for Teaching About Asia Director, and we want to express our thanks both to the University of Pittsburgh NCTA, as well as the Japan America Society of Pennsylvania for co-sponsoring this program. Dr. Ann Prescott is the director of the Five College Center for East Asian Studies in Massachusetts and is one of the 7 national directors of the NCTA. She was trained as an ethnomusicologist and has been studying about Japan since she began playing the Koto as a sophomore at Cornell College in Iowa. She spent 8 years living and studying Koto and shamisen in Japan, including 1 year as a research student at Tokyo University of the Arts. She is the editor of and contributing author to East Asia in the World, An Introduction, which was published by Routledge in 2015 and which won the Association for Asian Studies Buchanan Prize in 2016. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Prescott, who's going to give us some background and history on the instrument Koto.
Thank you very much, Brenda. I'm really happy to be here and talk about the Koto. It's my favorite thing to talk about. Stephen, if you can put the first slide up for me, please. Thank you. I'm going to start with a very short overview of Japanese music in general before I jump into Koto music. So Stephen, if you could do the next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk about not only traditional music genres, but other musicking or music-making activities in Japan. Next slide, please. The vast majority of music making in Japan is Western, and this is due to the Meiji-era decision instituted in the 1890s to teach Western music in the schools. And on the screen, you can see some things that reflect pretty accurately music making in Japan. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is heard everywhere at the end of the year. And this poster says, don't just listen, participate also in Beethoven's Ninth. Hula is very popular. Salsa music, on the lower right, you have Orquesta de la Luis, one of the top salsa groups in Japan. You'll also have tango, jazz, any kind of Western-based music. Until the early 21st century, traditional music was barely mentioned in the 9 years of compulsory education in Japan. One piece from each of the Gagaku, Kabuki, and Koto traditions were taught in the schools. Now, since the beginning of this century, students are required to have 1 year of hands-on experience with traditional instruments in junior high, but the genre is completely up to the teacher. And in fact, there are only a handful of teachers, music teachers, who have any training and experience with traditional music. So it's really hit or miss what students get. Next slide, please. So here we have J-pop on the right, which is Western-based, but with Japanese characteristics, shall we say, but no Japanese instruments. Okinawan music and tsugaru shamisen and folk song are both using traditional instruments and traditional playing styles, but they have made the jump a little bit into the pop music arena and into popularity, often because of commercial or other television tie-ins. J-pop is often sold in Japanese music stores, when there were music stores, under the guise of traditional music, looking at it from the aspect of it's from Japan and Japanese people are in it. They use the term holgaku to lump anything that comes from Japan together. But then how do you differentiate J-pop, which is really Western in nature, from other things that are using Japanese instruments? And in that case, the recording industry uses jun holgaku, or pure Japanese music, pure traditional music, when they're talking about music for Japanese instruments. And I used to like to go into music stores and ask them for holgaku, which should be Japanese music, and they'd take me to the section with J-pop, and I'd say, no, I want jun holgaku, pure Japanese music. Next slide, please. So I'd like to just give you a list of the traditional types of music and instruments in roughly chronological order. And I've noted the eras in which they began or the eras in which they became part of the Japanese landscape. All of them use traditional instruments with the exception of enka, which is down next to the last, but it is an older style of pop music, which today is considered to be really traditional. And it also uses traditional instruments, particularly the shakuhachi and the shamisen from time to time, even today. The taiko, the last one, the taiko itself, the drum has been around for a long time, but it's really not until the 20th century post-war where we see taiko playing as we think of it today in groups playing pieces. That's a fairly new tradition, and hopefully your speaker on taiko music will go into that some more. Of these, again, they're all extant today. Of these, though, the shakuhachi is probably the most popular, partially because it's so easy to carry around. Although it does crack in dry weather, it is small and portable, and it's the shakuhachi which is the best known outside of Japan, and there are vibrant shakuhachi communities around the world. The Koto sound is known outside of Japan. In fact, most synthesizers have a Koto sound on it. But because it's big and it's really hard to maintain the strings, it's not as popular outside of the country. The shamisen of the individual instruments is probably the most popular, most widely used because it's used in a lot of genres, from theater genres to folk music to kinds of chamber music. And it's easier to carry around than the koto, but again, maintenance is really tough on the shamisen. And so its popularity outside of Japan is limited. Next slide, please. So I have a list of things of what you should know about traditional Japanese music, and these are in no particular order. They're in the order that they came to my mind. So let's start out with most traditional Japanese instruments originated in China, but the music played on those instruments has changed dramatically. So the music that's played on the cousin of the koto in China is dramatically different than the music played on the koto in Japan. And I found this out firsthand when I took lessons on the Chinese version of the koto when I was in graduate school, assuming that it would be a fairly easy transfer, and it was not at all. Each traditional Japanese instrument has its own notation system, and some instruments have more than one notation system. So there's no such thing as a score that has the parts for all of the instruments. Even if they're playing together, each instrument has its own notation system, and it's learned as a part unto itself. So big band rehearsals or orchestra rehearsals, such as we're used to, come very late in the process in Japan in terms of when you learn it with your teacher, with your part, and then just before the concert, you come together. And if you've learned it accurately, it sounds fine. Some instruments have more than one notation system. We'll look at this example in Koto. New music continues to be composed for all traditional Japanese instruments. I hear so often people thinking that traditional music is somehow frozen in the past and it never changes, and nothing could be further than the truth. For all instruments, new music continues to be composed, for some more than others, but I don't think I know of a genre that there isn't new music for that instrument. Traditional Japanese music is organized into stylistic schools for each instrument, each with its own headmaster, styles, and repertoire. So for the koto, there are two big schools, Ikuta and Yamada, and there's a separate person at the top. The styles are different, different history, and more importantly, repertoire. So a person from Yamada school most often cannot play with a person from Ikuta school. Now, some of the very oldest, before they split off, Yamada split off from Ikuta, there's a little bit of common repertoire, but there have been some subtle changes in even that. Modern repertoire, for various reasons, sometimes they can play together and sometimes they can't. And that's, I think, part two of this semester two. So we're not going to get into that today. If you could go to the next slide, please. Traditional Japanese music has not been a part of the school music classes until recently, as I mentioned a minute ago, and it's still not the primary focus. So what you have is two parallel systems for learning music: Western music in the schools, and if you want to learn traditional music, you take private lessons. Something I feel strongly, the next point, music is not a universal language. And in this case, different listening techniques are required for traditional Japanese music, horizontal rather than vertical. We even have this in the West, parents saying, I don't understand my kids' music. What is that trashy stuff? That's not music. It's because there are comprehension issues. And so for traditional Japanese music, let's start with Western music. Things are divided into chords that line up vertically, right? In Japanese music, even if you have two voices, you listen to them horizontally. And if they line up vertically, it's more often than not coincidental. Not always, but for the most part, you're listening to parallel streams. So it's like you're listening to two languages at the same time, or two conversations at the same time. Traditionally, the concept of space and silence is different, and I'll go over this in detail in a minute. The master-student relationship is paramount. You have one master and you stick with that master, and it's very difficult to change and study with another teacher. In the West, this is sometimes encouraged. Some teachers have strengths that others don't, but not in Japan. Your loyalty is to one teacher. And we do it the way it's always been done. This is really important in most genres, that you learn it exactly the way your teacher teaches you, that you don't put your own spin on it, your own interpretation. You do exactly the way you've taught. There may be some space for your own interpretation way later in your life, but even that can get controversial, and some genres tolerate this better than others. Next slide, please. So the top character there you see there is the character for this instrument you see behind me, the koto. And Japanese characters, kanji, always have at least two readings, sometimes more. And this one can be read as koto or so. Then you see the next character down, and it can be read as koto or kin. Traditionally in China, these are two different instruments, the top koto and the bottom koto, the top so and the bottom kin. In Japan, the bottom character, koto, also kin, has become what's used by non-specialists, but it's more of a generic thing. So for example, pre-war, the piano was called the something kin. I don't remember now what it was. So pre-war, kin was used as a generic string instrument. Today, the top character is only used or primarily used by specialists, and that is the actual instrument. That is the character for my instrument. And at the bottom, you see so kyoku, which is what we call koto music. And in that case, you have to use the top character, because otherwise it would be kin kyoku or something, and that's not a word. But you will find in advertising and newspapers a lot the bottom character is what's used, but it's really the top one. So Stephen, if you go to the next slide, I'll show you the two instruments. So the top instrument is the Chinese instrument chin, which is the kin or koto. And the bottom instrument is the Chinese zhang, the Japanese so or koto. You'll see the top instrument has 7 strings, but what's more important is it has no bridges, and you play by pushing your finger by those white dots, kind of like a guitar kind of thing. And the bottom instrument with the bridges was at one time the same as the Japanese koto. So that's the difference in China. Next slide, please. People seem to have a preconceived idea of what the koto is and what a koto player looks like. So I challenge you here. I have 3 photos of people doing koto activity. Even though the person on the right has a bleach blonde hair, he often has purple hair, but in this photo, he does not have purple hair, playing in Western clothing. In the upper left, you have a woman playing seated on a chair with the koto on a stand. Probably that's what many of you have a more traditional idea. And then the bottom left, again, is an older illustration of a woman in a flowing kimono seated on the floor. So yeah, traditionally you sit on the floor to play the koto. Since about the 1920s, and as people's knees start to not work so well, most people today, particularly when they're playing modern music, will sit in a chair. It also helps with projecting the sound out. You know, traditionally koto was played in a small room and people were seated close by, but today in big concert halls, you have to have some way of getting the sound out. So another point that it brings up is the fact that it's a living tradition and people are playing new music. There is definitely a strong desire that even people who play modern music, whether their hair is purple or blonde or whatever color, have a good grounding in the traditions. That's not so different from the West. You know, everybody starts with Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, whatever goes furthest back in their own instrumental tradition. And then they go with the more modern. And depending upon what their specialty is, they always have to have that good grounding. All right, next slide, please. There are two important aesthetic ideas in koto music that I'd like to talk about briefly. The first is ma. Teachers in the koto tradition don't actively discuss ma in the context of music. I don't think I ever heard my teacher say the word ma, maybe once long ago. You do hear the word more in other arts, particularly architecture. And if you'd like to learn more about ma in Japan, I'd strongly recommend the documentary called Dream Window: Reflections on the Japanese Garden. It's not just about gardens, it's about architecture, it's about music, it's about movement, it's about calligraphy. And you'll find information on accessing that film on your resource handout. The character for ma tells you exactly what it means. It's composed of two parts: a gate with the sun in the middle, and that's ma, space. So it's the sunlight coming through the gates of the crack between the gates. That's ma. And to further explain it, Stephen, if you could go to the next slide. Ma has to be surrounded by something. Ma can't just be a blank screen. Ma, here I have the white border. We can say what's in the middle of there is ma. So if you look up in the sky, in the big blue sky, that's not ma unless it's set off by maybe the branches of a tree. Negative space in calligraphy can be ma because it's set off by the strokes. So in music, ma is silence, and silence has to be set off by something. So trailing off at the end of the piece is not ma because you have to have something before and after it. And also traditionally, silence is simply another kind of sound. It's non-sound sound. We do have kind of a ma idea in Western music, but we don't call it ma, and it has a different function, in my opinion, in Western music. So in Western music, silence is used to heighten tension. So think of Blue Danube Waltz. Do, 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 do. You put the space in there to anticipate, to heighten the tension, and then the release when it gets to the next note. Traditionally, ma in Japanese music didn't have that function. It was simply another kind of sound. Now, since Western music has been taught in the schools for over 100 years, is there still that different perception in Japan? Or does it now create tension? This is the kinds of things I think about when I'm awake at night. I don't know, but traditionally, ma in music was simply a non-sound sound. Next slide, please. The other thing that's really important is kata. How you do something is as important as what you do. Or at least that's the theory, that if you do it right, then the sound will come. So if you have the right kata, the right posture, the right holding your hand, holding your head, if you do all that correctly, the sound as it is intended will come. And there's a shakuhachi player, an American named Christopher Blaisdell, who's written about this phenomenon, being pushed on the stage before he could really play very well. And teachers said, that's okay. What's really important is the kata. If you look good, that's 80% of the battle. So it's also really important that everybody in the group do the same thing. There's no emoting like in Western music. Everybody holds their head the same, holds their hands the same. And kata really reinforces that and makes that possible. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn to the koto itself and the history of the koto. The koto came to Japan from China as part of the gagaku, court music ensemble. You see the full ensemble on the left, and on the right I put a picture of just part of the ensemble so you could see the koto up close. Soon after gagaku music came to Japan, around the 8th century, the koto began to be used outside of the gagaku ensemble. We don't have any idea really what the music sounded like. We only know that it was used that way because of literature with descriptions of so-and-so accompanying themselves on the koto while they recited or sang a poem. And so we have the lyrics, but we don't have the music. So we do know that it was a solo instrument to accompany songs. We don't really know what those songs sounded like. Some people have tried to guess based on various sources, but in fact, we really don't know what it sounded like. The next slide, please. So we don't know anything until the 17th century and this man called Yatsuhashi Kengyo. He died in 1685, and as koto players often delight in telling me, 1685 is the year that Bach was born, and Bach is considered to be the father of modern Western music. And so they really like to point out that koto music is older than Western music. Yatsuhashi Kengyo died the year that Bach was born. So we trace our modern playing tradition to this man. It's his compositions we have that are the oldest extant compositions. Although he's credited with composing the oldest extant work called Rokudan no Shirabe, and I'll play a little bit of that in a minute, it's likely that he didn't actually compose it, but rather took an older song and codified it, changed the tuning or established the tuning, and established the playing techniques for it. His grave is in Kyoto. We don't know a lot about his life, and that's because people in Japan, as they became higher masters, they changed their names, and so it makes it really hard to trace people. In his name, Yatsuhashi is his family name. Kengyo is a title, and this title denotes a blind male who is a master. And there are different ranks, so Kengyo is like the black belt of koto playing. There is one higher rank, but it's kind of an honorific rank rather than an achievement rank. So if you put in your time, you can get the higher one. But it was an established system meant to help blind men support their families. So it was restricted to blind men. And they were the only ones legally allowed to be master teachers and performers. Now, this doesn't mean that sighted people didn't play, and it doesn't mean that women didn't play, but they didn't have access to these titles and weren't entitled to use them. These titles dropped away with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. There were people getting the title after that, but they didn't use it. And by the beginning of the 20th century, early 20th century, people weren't, it wasn't in use at all. Miyagi Michio, born in 1894, did officially attain the rank of Kengyo as a blind master, but it was not meant in the same fashion as it did before the Meiji Restoration, when it really carried a lot of weight. Next slide, please. If you've ever been to Kyoto, you may know this sweet called a yatsuhashi. On the left is the cookie yatsuhashi, cinnamon flavored. On the right is what they call nama yatsuhashi, or maybe fresh. It's not baked, it has filling inside. But if you look at the one on the left, it is in fact supposed to be in the shape of a koto, and it is in fact named after Yatsuhashi Kengyo, and that's how it gets its name, Yatsuhashi. And if you buy a box of these, every box I've bought of the the ones on the left, has an insert telling you who Yatsuhashi Kengyo is. But I found that very, very few people read that insert because I usually am the one that tells them that these are named after Yatsuhashi Kengyo and who Yatsuhashi Kengyo is. So read that insert if you ever go to Japan. And if you can't read Japanese, ask somebody to read it for you. You can educate them as well. Next slide, please. An important part of koto playing is playing in an ensemble. There is a lot of solo music, but there's a lot of ensemble music too. And the ensemble music is called sankyoku, which literally means 3 tunes or 3 melodies. Today, it's koto. You see the instrument on the left, shamisen, instrument in the middle, and shakuhachi, the instrument on the right in that picture. This picture happens to be in London. Originally, the shakuhachi was not a part of this ensemble for historic reasons. Long story, that also goes into the second semester. Originally, it was this instrument called the kokyu that you see an illustration on the right-hand side of your screen, another stringed instrument played with a bow. But with the Meiji Restoration, the kokyu was replaced by the shakuhachi. And today, the sankyoku ensemble is koto, shamisen, and shakuhachi. Now, this doesn't mean that all 3 instruments have to play together. In fact, it's fairly rare to find all 3 of them playing together. But the music that is played is still called sankyoku, even if there's only 1 instrument or 2 instruments. It's still called sankyoku. Another unique thing about sankyoku is that each part is composed by a different composer, often at very different times. So one of the instruments has the original composition, and then over time, other composers have added other parts. Most of them, a couple hundred years ago, they were added. But people are still composing new parts for sankyoku pieces. And in fact, there's a shakuhachi player who lives near me, studied in Hokkaido, and her teacher wrote a few years ago, a new shakuhachi part to go with the piece Rokudan. Still sankyoku. You can still perform it with koto and shakuhachi or all 3 parts. And so that gets also to that whole horizontal listening thing. Adding another part doesn't really change much other than the experience of listening to it that way. Next slide, please. So the primary mover and changer for the 20th century is this man by the name of Miyagi Michio. He was born in 1894 and died in 1956. And I did my research for many years in Japan and many years after on Miyagi Michio. He's called the father of contemporary koto music. He was blind from an early age. He started to lose his sight when he was just under the age of 1, completely blind by, I believe he was about 7 when he completely lost his sight. It's in the Meiji era, so koto is no longer a profession that's protected for the blind, but because he lived in Kobe and there were no schools for the blind in the area, he was apprenticed to a teacher in Kobe in the traditional manner. In 1907, at the age of just barely 13, he moved to Korea to support his family. His father ran a shop in Korea, which at the time was colonized by the Japanese. His father had been injured, so he was called to Korea to come support his family, which is his parents and 2 younger siblings. Because he was blind, his repertoire was limited to what he had learned. And even though at that time he had already earned a teacher rank in just a few years, and so he was entitled to teach, in fact, his repertoire was limited. So what did he do? Well, he learned from others, Yamada School players, for one, which would have been strictly forbidden in Japan. And he started composing his own works, which if he had done that in Japan, he would have had to be 50 years old, 60 years old before he was recognized as enough of an authority to write his own works. But at the age of 14, he wrote his first work called Mizuno Hentai, which is still performed today, which is still considered to be a masterpiece, on words from his brother's science textbook. At that time, it was really popular to write even science textbooks in poetic verse. And because he was blind and couldn't go to school, his brother would often read textbooks to him, and that's what he used for the lyrics. He moved back to Japan in 1917 after 10 years, and he soon became known for his new style compositions and brilliant playing technique. He revolutionized koto playing compositions. He used technology and became very, very famous for his new style. This was partially enabled by the fact in the 1920s was a time of great westernization in Japan. So there wasn't as much pushback, particularly among those who were trained in Western music, as there would have been even 20, 30 years before that. Next slide, please. Miyagi's best known invention is this 17-string jusichigen, which we often call bass koto in English. He felt that Japanese music needed a low voice, and so in 1921 he invented this instrument. It's widely used today. And he originally built two. In 1923 he had a smaller one in the cello range built. But with the addition of piano tuning pins, as you can see in the lower right of this picture, it became easy to lower the pitch or raise the pitch between a bass and a cello range. And so the two became one. And today there's just one bass koto with 17 strings. The strings are thicker than in the normal koto, and it also uses different diameter strings for higher and lower pitches. The bridges are also substantially larger. It's only slightly longer than the 6-foot-long 13-string koto, but it's much thicker and it's wider, and it has a much lower sound. Next slide, please. Here are three of the really leading players in the ikuta style of koto playing today. There are more, but these are the people in my lineage, descendants of Miyagi in some sort or another. In the upper left, Nosaka Soju, known most of her life as Nosaka Keiko. She was an amazing, amazing player, and I'm going to talk about her a little bit more in a minute. It's said that her entrance audition for Tokyo University of the Arts far exceeded 99% of the graduation recitals. And there have been some brilliant people that went through there. She was just a brilliant player. Did a little composing, but mostly a really brilliant player. She took the name Soju after her mother passed away, so it's an artistic name. Her name, Nosaka Keiko, is under what most of her recordings and work are under. In the upper right, Sawai Tadao, the preeminent late 20th century composer, in my opinion. There are other composers, but he really pushed beyond Miyagi's innovations and took koto in completely new directions. His wife, Sawai Kazue, is the greatest interpreter, in my opinion, of bass koto music. Miyagi's works, her husband's works, and other composers' works for bass koto. Tadao Sensei was a brilliant performer, and he had one lesson with Miyagi before Miyagi died. So Miyagi was teaching at Tokyo University of the Arts, and Tadao Sensei was a freshman when Miyagi died. Sawai Kazue was Miyagi's student from a young age, so she had more time learning really under Miyagi's style. Nosaka Soju, her mother had her own school, but they're closely aligned with Miyagi's style, and she collaborated in her later years with Sawai Kazue, two most brilliant women performers. Sawai Kazue went into jazz, went into improv. Tadao Sensei did things like prepared koto, playing the koto with a bow, jazz improvisation. So Tadao Sensei as the composer and Kazue Sensei as the performer really pushed koto forward in this century. Next slide, please. So Nosaka Keiko was involved with inventing a 20-string koto, nijugen. She was a member of Pro Musica Nipponia, which is an ensemble that commissioned lots of new works for an orchestra of traditional instruments that is not traditional at all. And Miki Minoru, a a very famous composer in both Western and Japanese traditions, was a composer for Pro Musica Nipponia. And in 1969, the two of them invented a 20-string koto. It's the same range as the 13-string koto, so it's a relatively higher pitched instrument, but with more strings, you have more versatility. Now, the 20-string koto actually has 21 strings, and this is because there's a certain playing technique where you have to rebound off a lower string. And some of Miki's early compositions used the bottom string, and when there was nothing to rebound off of, it was very difficult to play. So they added a 21st string. However, they'd already started calling it the nijugen, the 20-string koto. So today we continue to call it the 20-string koto, and it has 21 strings. Next slide, please. If you'd like to know what the notation looks like, this is the notation for sakura, and this is a simplified version that I made up. And each box is a beat. It was not, this notation wasn't created until the beginning of the 20th century. As I said before, blind men were the masters and the teachers, and they had no reason to have notation. Sighted people, particularly women, did come up with shorthand ways to do it. But this notation was developed in the 20th century. So each box is a beat, and the double line is the end of a measure. It's read top to bottom, right to left, and it's play by string number. So if you know Japanese numbers, in the upper right-hand box, that's a 7. The next box down is 7. The next box down is 8. And then that circle with a dot in the middle is a rest. That's the end of the measure. So it goes 7, 7, 8, rest. 7, 7, 8, rest. 7, 8, 9, 8. Now we're at the end of the first line. 7, 8, 7, 6, rest. So the 8 and the 7, 2 notes in one box, it's 8th notes. All right, if you can go to the next slide, please, Stephen. So this is a real piece of music that I've added some notes to. I've put the string numbers in there so you can see it. It tells you the name of the piece, Rokudan no Shirabe. It names the tunings. We have named tunings that people simply memorize. For more contemporary works, composers will write a tuning and then they'll say, from that tuning, move this string up, move this string down. But there are a set of tunings that we learn the names of. And this is what a real piece of music looks like. Not that different than the Sakura one that I mocked up. If you could go to the next one, please. Yeah, and here are side-by-side 2 different versions of koto music. The one on the left is much more modern than the one on the right is Rokudan, which you just saw in a minute ago. The one on the left, it doesn't have any boxes. It uses bars like you would 8th notes or 16th notes on the side of the notes to tell you these notes belong together and this is their duration. It's particularly handy for music that changes meter. And you'll see this one, it starts in 3/4, goes to 4/4, 3/4, 4/4. It's a lot easier to handle in this style of notation. So those are the 2 that we use in Ikuta Ryu. Yamada Ryu uses a horizontal notation system, again, invented in the 20th century. I've played one piece in 1987 off of that. Probably couldn't do it again if I tried unless I spent a lot of time doing it. They're very different. These 2 styles, though, are not that different, particularly if you can read Western music. It's a fairly easy to learn both of these styles. And if you want these, we can certainly supply you with copies of this music if you'd like to look at them more carefully. Now we come to the playing portion of the program. So Stephen, if you could go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to play for you. First, I'm going to play Rokudan. Sorry, Stephen, can you back up to one of the Rokudan, maybe 2 slides back? One more slide back. Yeah, let's go with this. So Rokudan no Shirabe, again, it's the oldest extant piece we have. We don't know when it was composed, but we do know that the composer Yatsuhashi Kengyo died in 1685. It's made to contain all of the traditional playing techniques. The shirabe part, means investigate, but what that really means is once you know this, you're going to know all of the playing techniques. It's not 100% true, but you'll know 80% of them. Rokudan means 6 sections. Each section has the same number of beats, but each section is played progressively faster. It's quite long because the early sections are very slow. So just to give you some idea of how it goes, I'm going to play the first section and then the last section. And you'll know when I turn the page as I'm going from the first section to the last section. Then you'll really get an idea of how much faster the last section is. So I have to stand up and go back to my koto. My foot's asleep. Picks are over here. And I need to put my music stand in front of me, so hopefully you can still see. So Rokudan no Shirabe, the first dan or the first section, and then the 6th dan. Let me put something in here so I can turn the page quickly. So that's the first and the sixth dans of Rokudan, the first section and the sixth section, each with the same number of beats, but because the tempo is faster for the sixth section, it seems much shorter. All right, the next piece I'd like to play is called Kurokami. Rokudan is a little unusual in traditional music in that most traditional music is in fact, vocal music accompanied by the koto player. We do say that some koto players are better singers than others, but there are very few times when a separate singer and a separate player. If you're playing, you sing. If you're singing, you're playing. And that's just the way it is. And so one person accompanies themselves. Kurokami is a bit of an unusual piece because it's known in a number of genres. The tunes may be different, slightly different, but the poetry is the same. And that's very, very unusual across traditional music that you have the same song. It does happen, but it's not common. And again, this is more ordinary for pre-20th century music that has lyrics. I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's quite long. But I'm going to do a little bit. I think I tied up my black hair with strong feelings, blah, blah, in my heart. Maybe I'll go to a pillow at night, but I'm not going to do the whole thing. But I want to give you an idea of what it's like to hear somebody sing and play at the same time. Traditionally, even today, men and women sing at the same pitch level, except for 20th century works, which may be composed for a specific pitch level. But there's no idea of men singing down an octave. If it's too high for men, they open their mouths and hope for the best. If it's too low for women, you open your mouth and hope for the best. So everybody sings at the same pitch level. So here's a little bit of Kurokami. So that's the traditional style of singing and playing together, which again is more normal, more ordinary before the 20th century. There's a big shift in the 20th century with less singing and more likely to be solo music. Now, you see the bridges come out, and for the next piece, I'm going to play Maritsuki. This is composed by Miyagi Michio. Bouncing ball is what I call it in English. See if we get, there we go. Miyagi, because he was blind, often wrote about things that he experienced through his ears. And he loved to listen to children playing games outside. And so he wrote a lot of songs about children playing games, how he perceived their games through his ears. Miyagi also wrote a lot of works for children. He wrote more works for children than most composers write in their entire lives. He has over 400 extant works, and it's thought that he composed probably around 700. A lot of things were lost during the war. And so, we don't have his whole library of compositions, but Maritsuki is a delightful little piece, and it's really short. It's great for kindergartners because you can keep them busy by having them bounce with the beat. That's another thing about this. You noticed with Rokudan and Kurokami, there's a beat, but it's not really strong like in Western music. You couldn't really tap your toe to it. You definitely can to Maritsuki, and as we get into the 20th century, you can definitely tap your toe to more things or clap along with the beat. You'll also see that Miyagi in this piece uses both hands. I mean, kind of put the music off to the side so hopefully you can see. So he uses both hands for different effects, including he imitates the sound of a bouncing ball, which I think you will hear really easily. So it's only a really short piece. Like I said, great for kindergartners. Only can they tap their toes or bounce their hands. It's only about 90 seconds long. So listen for the effects of the bouncing ball. Let's see if I'm still in tune. It's fairly humid today. Kotos like humidity. Keeps them in tune. Once you get them in tune. Unless there's too much humidity. All right, here we go. So I think you can hear the things that sound like a bouncing ball, right? Pressing the string raises the pitch. It's a pentatonic scale. So if we want pitches in between, we use the left hand to press the string. A half step or a whole step. He uses that sometimes for the effect of the pitch, but also for the sound effect. And we also have staccato, which Miyagi took from Western music. I'd like to play one final piece that may be very familiar to all of you. Sakura, Sakura. This was the piece that I put up learn to look at the notation. And we're a little bit beyond cherry blossom time, unless you live way far north. Cherry blossoms haven't been gone that long here. But just for something familiar for you, and you'll really be able to see the left-hand presses because there aren't very many of them in Sakura. So once through with a melody and then with a variation. And with that, I'd like to thank you for being here today. And I always love to talk about the Koto. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. And I'm always happy to talk about the Koto. Thank you very much.